And here we go. I want to talk a bit about ecology. We need a little background on this before we get to looking at the specifics of the oceans themselves. And I'm sure some of you have had the ecology class. I'm not sure if it's a prereq for this particular one or not. Evidently it's not. But some of you may have taken it before, and if so, this is probably going to be very much a review, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, starting from the same point. You can study ecology at different levels of organization. We talk about population ecology, is what goes on in the set of all members of a single species in a single area. Just a second, I heard the ding-dong. Okay, there's our ding-dong. Right, here we go. All members of a single species in one area make up a population. Sometimes it's useful to talk about meta-populations. I heard the ding-dong again, which would be a group of populations connected by dispersal. So, three patches of dandelions or something like that that may be separated from each other, maybe by sidewalks or something, but all of which can interbreed with each other. Would be useful to call that a meta-population, sort of group of connected populations. If you have a set of interacting populations of different species, we call that a community. So we could talk about the fish community of the Louisiana Gulf Coast salt marsh, or the hydrothermal vent community of strange creatures around these superheated water vents boiling out of the deep ocean, something like that. And when you take the sum of communities in one area and you relate them to their non-living surroundings, all of the things that are important for life but that are not actually alive, which could be anything from salt content to amount of sunlight to pH of the water, water temperature, all of those things that determine what can live there but that are not alive themselves. We can talk about that as an ecosystem, the sum of the communities in an area plus the non-living factors that affect them. If you have a set of similar ecosystems worldwide, we call that a biome. For example, there are coral reefs in the Caribbean and the Pacific. They have pretty different species between them, and yet there are some things that are true of both of them. They'll both have similar architecture, they'll be built in the same way, they'll have different species but filling the same kinds of ecological roles. So we could talk about the tropical coral reef biome. If you land lovers want an example of one on land, we can talk about the prairie biome. Or the, we've got a piece of that in the nature reserve, and of course we used to have it over, much of what would become the United States. Or you could talk about, the tropical rainforest biome, or the temperate rainforest biome, or the mountain tundra biome, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, the sum of all life on Earth is called the biosphere. So when we look at things that go on in populations, populations, a bunch of organisms in one species that live and die, as all living things must, and we can take a look at when they're doing it and how many of them are doing it. And what you're looking at here is a plot of the fraction of surviving individuals of the species against its age. So for example, the top curve labeled with a human is labeled late loss. meaning that most of our mortality happens late in life. If you have 100 babies that are born after a year, we do have some infant mortality, but maybe 99% of the babies would still be expected to be alive. And maybe 95% would still be alive into, I don't know, their 30s. And you don't start getting sharp drop-offs in the fraction of people that are still alive until you get to, about 70 years or so. Most of our mortality happens late in our lifespan. If you look at certain fish, for example, almost all of the mortality is very early in the lifespan. And I'll show you a couple of spectacular examples of that in just a bit. And species like birds, typically mortality is pretty much constant throughout the lifespan. They're neither more likely to die young nor more likely to die old. They've got pretty much the same relative risk of death no matter when you look at them. That crop curve is called a type 1 life history. That's what we've got, and that's what this sea otter snuggling her baby has. Species with that kind of life history, that kind of mortality curve, are typically what we call K-selected. They don't increase very fast. It may take, reproduction rates are relatively slow. It may take a long time for a population to grow, but most of the dying is done by older members of a cohort just being the set of all members of a population of a certain age. So, if we looked at, all of the kids born in Conway in 2011, that would be a cohort. And in K-selected species, the species doesn't increase its numbers very fast, and there's a great deal of parental investment. Now, in the case of mammals, this is pretty obvious because mommy mammals invest a great deal of energy in, nurturing the fetus in the uterus before it's even born. That takes a great deal of metabolic energy on the part of the mother. And then after that, mommy feeds the babies with milk, and that takes an enormous effort of energy. When my wife was breastfeeding our son, she would go right to sleep as soon as it happened. Somebody calculated that a woman nursing twins is burning as many calories as a soldier in basic training. Yeah, she ate an awful lot, and she, slept a lot and got really tired. It doesn't look like hard work, but it costs a great deal of metabolic energy to make that, to make all that food. And this would be true of any mammal as well. Many mammals have other forms of parental care, whether it's mommy cat dragging mice back for the kittens to play with and learn how to hunt, or daddy dragging his son to play soccer, or whatever it is. There's a lot of marine invertebrates that have the complete opposite. What you're looking at is Zestospongia, the Caribbean barrel sponge. These things can get big enough that a single diver can crouch inside. Sponges don't really have much in the way of a nervous system or anything like that. They're filter feeders, and they can crank out ridiculous numbers of offspring. That's eggs being released from a single barrel sponge. They're also releasing sperm. Off the bat, I cannot remember whether these have separate sexes or not. I'd have to look that up. But they're firing big clouds of eggs and sperm into the water. It's like, sponge sperm soup in there. And the overwhelming majority of little fertilized sponge eggs that are produced are not going to make it to adulthood. I mean, if you're producing, let's say, 100 million eggs, they're not all going to grow into 100 million barrel sponges, or within very short time, there would be no room for anything else. Right? Remember, this is part of Darwin's insights that more offspring are going to be produced than can survive. Hang on, I just heard the ding dong. And there we go. Okay, so far more offspring are produced than can survive. The vast majority of these fertilized sponge eggs are going to get eaten by something else, or swept away into the deep, or get attacked by bacteria, or otherwise meet a horrible end before they ever get to be even small barrel sponges. And even fewer of those will grow up to be that large. And we call that a type 3 curve. And we call that type of life history strategy R-selected. Because this is the strategy that pirates use. They're R-selected. Get it? Right. Okay. Sorry, I shouldn't have told that joke, but I heard it on the pirate radio station. It's called NPR. Okay, thank you. Right. So here's a couple of oysters doing the nasty. Firing off big clouds of eggs and sperm in summertime when the tide is low and the moon is full. I think that's eggs on the left and sperm on the right. And a single oyster may release 100 million eggs every season. And if a female oyster is not yanked out of the ocean and served on the half shell with nice ketchup and horseradish sauce, she might live for 20 years. So she can literally produce 2 billion offspring. The males can certainly produce sperm to match. And the overwhelming majority of those are never going to make it to be new oysters. They will almost all get eaten by something, or, you know, swept off into the ocean and lost forever or something like that. Even if they manage to keep from getting eaten by something, some of them will never settle down to the bottom and find a place where they can metamorphose from floaters into settled oysters. So it's two different strategies. Do you invest a lot of energy in a few offspring, or almost no energy in huge numbers of offspring? The answer is that from a scientific point of view, neither one is particularly right or wrong. There's just what works and what doesn't work in a particular environment. Species with this R-selected life history, or a type 3 curve, are often very good at colonizing disturbed habitats. Think weeds, right? Lots of weeds are pretty small and unimpressive plants, but they produce crazy numbers of seeds. So no sooner do you have a bare patch on your lawn than boom, it gets colonized by, you know, all kinds of little plants like that. And it takes a lot longer for more K-selected species like trees to establish themselves. So each one works well in some circumstances, not so much in others. Oh, here's a really cool marine contrast for a K-selected life history. The mammals were pretty obvious, but that's the embryo of a female great white shark that was caught accidentally in 2017. She had 3 embryos in each uterus. That's what one of them looks like. Sharks have 2 uteruses, by the way, left and a right. But great white sharks feed their babies. First of all, they produce a lot more eggs than ever get fertilized, and most of the eggs end up as food for the embryonic sharks that are growing inside. So she had 60 uterine eggs in each uterus, and about 21 gallons of a nutrient-rich secretion from the uterus wall, very rich in lipids, called uterine milk. So the walls of her uterus are giving this milk that the babies are drinking, and she's producing extra eggs for the babies to eat. So that's a very type 1 life cycle where you're not producing very many offspring, but they're all getting lots and lots of nutrients, lots and lots of resources, lots of investment. The parents are investing a great deal of energy in creating that eggs and milk for their babies. Makes me think we ought to write some new verses for baby shark, baby shark, baby shark, baby shark. For some species, eat your siblings, eat your siblings. Because yeah, you actually get siblings eating each other while they're still in mommy's uterus in some species of shark. They actually, I think they actually were able to see this on ultrasound, where they found one fetal shark crawled from his uterus into mommy's other uterus, ate his brothers, and crawled back. I remember reading about that. Sharks are weird, man. And now I've earwormed myself. And I'll probably earwormed you. You're going to be singing this for the rest of the day. Sorry. Right. Okay. The set of all conditions under which a population can persist is called its ecological niche. And when I teach 1400, the way I explain it is by a non-marine metaphor. Imagine that you're going to, it's spring and you're going to the plant outlet. What am I? To buy some plants. And everyone that you buy is probably going to come with a little card that says, you know, plant in full sun, water frequently, or tolerate shade, do not overwater, needs extra nitrogen, or something like that. Descriptions like that are ways of describing those plants' niches, the conditions under which a population can persist and grow. A Russian guy named Gauss in the 30s, I believe, proposed what he called Gauss's law, which states that if you have two populations, they cannot permanently share exactly the same niche. You can't have two populations living in the same area under exactly the same conditions using exactly the same resources. If that happens, one of two things results. Either one population gets driven to extinction, either the populations compete and one of them is just better than the other in something and ultimately gains the edge. That's called competitive exclusion. The other possibility is that the two populations could end up subdividing the niche, and we call that niche partitioning. The example I always give is what would happen if, out of the blue, 20 shoe stores opened up on the same day in Valonia. Now think about it. Valonia is a nice enough little town, but you know, I don't think everybody there wears shoes. And even of those that do, right, there's what, a couple thousand people in Valonia, right? There's not likely to be enough of a consumer base to support 20 shoe stores, right? So you have a bunch of shoe stores that are all competing for the same resource, which in this case is people in Valonia who want to buy shoes. One likely outcome would be many of those stores would probably go belly up. Consumers would presumably go for the best deals, and some of those stores just might not be able to compete. They wouldn't be able to attract enough of the customer base. They would shut down. That's competitive exclusion. The other possibility is that some of those stores might be able to attract customers by specializing in, let's say, athletic footwear, right? Maybe they're not interested in selling stiletto heels, but they've got a really great lineup of all kinds of shoes for the Bologna Eagles football team, who I assume needs lots of good special shoes. There might be another store that's not so hot on athletic shoes, but is really good for, I don't know, work boots. And then maybe there's another one that is not so great on athletic shoes or work boots, but specializes in, I don't know, fancy shoes for going to church, which I gather you would need a lot of if you're in Bologna. So what would happen is you'd have shoe stores that would end up dividing that customer base, and each would specialize on part of it, and they wouldn't compete very much, right? A shoe that sells only athletic shoes is not competing for the same people as the store that sells, nice fancy leather pumps, perfect for that dress where you're going to go to Beryl Baptist Church on Sunday, or wherever it is that you go if you're in Bologna, right? Different customer bases. They've divided the population of people that want to buy shoes in Bologna, so they're not competing with each other. That would be niche partitioning. And there's some classic studies showing how this works out in real life. Joseph Connell's studies in the 70s, I believe, looking at two species of barnacles. These are barnacles. They look like little volcanoes. They are actually crustaceans. They are related to shrimp and crabs and all of that. And they'll start out looking like little, shrimp larvae swimming around. And then a larva will settle on an unoccupied piece of rock or piling for a pier, styrofoam floating piece of wood, hull of your boat if you don't take care of it. They'll settle on a solid surface, glue their heads down so they're never able to move, and their carapace becomes this kind of volcano-shaped shell. And when the tide comes in, they'll open up this little opening in the middle and kick out their legs and use those to filter feed, sweeping the water and bringing food particles down to the mouth. If you were a barnacle, you would be permanently glued to the floor by your head, and you would have to kick food particles towards your mouth. Probably just as well you're not a barnacle. But that's what these are. And he looked at two genera of barnacles on Scottish rocky coasts. A large one called Balanus, and a smaller one called Cathamalus. And they're both growing on the same rocks in Scotland. And what he found was this. We'll see this again. If you go to a rocky coastline, you have the tide coming in and going out. The water level will rise to a high point and drop to a low point, typically once a day, although sometimes twice. It's ultimately due to the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. But exactly when it happens depends on the shape of the coastline around you and things like that. We'll talk about tides later on, upcoming. And if you go to a rocky coastline and just go from the parking lot down to the low tide line, you see something called zonation. There's whole communities that are restricted to these horizontal bands. Up here you can see there's about midway up the picture, there's this yellow-green zone. There are certain algae that live there. They can withstand drying out. Those algae might only be underwater for maybe an hour a day, but they can live under conditions like that. And then below that, you can see a kind of white zone that's dominated by barnacles. And then below that, it's looking to me like you're getting a kind of pinkish green zone that looks like it's dominated by red algae and sea anemones. Critters that can't withstand drying out that much, so they have to live down in the lower zone. And this is very typical of rocky shores. You'll get these almost regular stripes of different communities of living things as you climb down from the land all the way down to the low tide level. Something I wish I could show you guys. We really need to, when this is all over, I want to pack all of you into a couple of buses and take you guys to Point Reyes, California would do very nicely. And go tide pooling and show you all of this stuff. Anyway, Connell in Scotland experimented. He took little patches of rocky coast and took a chisel and removed one species or the other. What happened was that when Balanus was removed, Cathamulus, which is the one you're seeing here, was perfectly capable of colonizing places where Balanus had been removed. Normally, Balanus settled in the lower intertidal zone, and normally it could outcompete Cathamulus. It grew faster. You know, if you put a Balanus and a Cathamulus together, the Balanus would basically grow faster and grow over the Cathamulus or otherwise dislodge it. So normally Balanus would outcompete Cathamulus in the lower zone. So when Connell removed Balanus, Cathamulus was perfectly capable of moving in. It just didn't normally because Balanus could outcompete it. With me there. However, when he removed Cathamulus, he found that Balanus could not colonize the upper zone. Let's go back to that zone picture. The critters that are living down at the bottom of that picture at the water line may only be exposed to the air for maybe an hour a day. They're not very well adapted to resist drying out. They don't have to stay out of the water for very long. The critters at the top there, that band of green algae, and then the barnacles just below it, the white speckles that you're seeing, they may be completely out of the water, quite possibly in the hot sun, for almost all of the day. They may only be submerged for an hour. Some of them only get splashed. They might never get really, submerged in the water at all, at least not normally. There are critters that are adapted to live only in that splashing zone. And if you're living up in the splashing zone, it's ecologically really tough because it's dry for most of the time. It can be very hot. If you're trying to feed on critters that live in the water, you may only have a very short period of time each day in which you can feed. So Cathamulus is perfectly capable of moving into the lower zone, but it was kept out because Balanus outcompetes it. But Balanus is not tough enough to live in the upper zone. It can't resist that periodic drying out. It can't survive that. So Cathamulus is capable of living in the lower and the upper. Balanus wins in the lower zone, but it can't move into the upper. So both species persist on the same rocky shore, growing within inches of each other. So Cathamulus is capable of living in all those zones, and we call that its fundamental niche, the niche that it can occupy. Balanus, however, outcompetes it in the lower zone. So unless you have a marine biologist interfering, Cathamulus only lives in the upper zone because Balanus keeps it out of the lower zone where it could otherwise live. So Cathamulus has a very wide fundamental niche, but a much more narrow realized niche. Cathamulus has a wide range of conditions under which it's capable of growing, but only a narrower slice of those conditions where it actually does grow. Part of where it's capable of growing, it can't grow because of competition with balance. So that's the difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. As we used to say in my undergrad ecology class, life's a niche, and then you die. Okay, very important case of seeming violation of Gauss's law, and it's called the paradox of the plankton. Plankton is that little thing shaped like a pill with the one eye, who's kind of the bad guy in SpongeBob, right? Okay, a couple people nodding, okay. Actual plankton is the set of all living things in a body of water. We can talk about lake plankton just as well as we could about the ocean. But it's the set of living things, animal and plant, that live up in the water off the bottom and that can't swim strongly enough that they can really determine their own position. These are living things that pretty much have to go where the currents take them, either because they can't actively swim or, like jellyfish, they're not strong enough swimmers that they can fight currents very well. So here's some plankton. We'll talk a lot more about plankton later. In fact, I'm going to order some for you guys to look at. I haven't forgotten my promise that we're going to try to do some quasi-hands-on activities in here if we can. You'll get to see some live plankton before we're done. These all happen to be photosynthetic. They're plant-like plankton, or as we say, phytoplankton. Little single-celled algae floating in the water. And the paradox of the plankton is that plankton all compete with each other for the same limited set of resources. And yet, in any given water sample, they tend to be quite diverse. This is some ocean plankton, and I'm seeing the algae here include those green balls. Those are photosynthetic. And there's a thing to the right that looks kind of like a pill with a green blotch in it. That's an alga of a type called a diatom. And then these things with horns in them are a type called dinoflagellates. So these are all single-celled. They're all photosynthetic. They all require things like nitrogen and phosphorus from the water. They're all using the same resources, and they're right next to each other. And yet, you virtually never see a water sample where one species dominates to the exclusion of all others. There's never really a permanent winner in planktonic ecosystems. So you get all of this diversity among a community where all of the species are theoretically occupying the same niche. And that's something that Gauss's law says shouldn't happen. The reason we think is that the planktonic environment is simply too dynamically unstable to allow any species to dominate. To you, it just looks like the surface of the ocean, but if you were plankton, very small, you would actually find it's a very patchy environment. You might have small areas where there's lots of nutrients and patches where there's none, and patches where there's predators and patches where there's aren't, and it's all constantly changing from second to second. So here, let's see, there's baby starfish in this picture, and I'm seeing a single-celled predator called a tintinid, and I'm seeing a little predatory floating snail, and I'm seeing a little ciliated thing that looks like a type of ciliate, single-celled ciliate called a suctorian. There's lots of different predators in here, but the thinking is that not one of them ever manages to get a competitive advantage simply because the environment is so unstable and so constantly changing, and it's not really a single environment if you could shrink yourself down and look at it up close. So Planktonic communities in the ocean are a case where Gauss's law is violated, which means that the plankton are all going to have to go to prison. Actually, it doesn't, because of course, if you violate the scientific law, then they change the law. So Gauss's law is not an ironclad law. It's a principle, and there are times when the principle doesn't work. So it goes. All right. Moving up to communities. When we look at marine communities, there are, of course, lots of species in there, many of which are trying to eat each other. I think I talked about this on Friday, or I will. You probably heard about food chains and food webs, right? The big fish eats the little fish, and the bigger fish eats the big fish, and yeah. But you can identify certain species in a marine community that we think of as foundation species, or another term is ecosystem engineers. They're species that create the structures on which other species depend. If we're talking about coral reefs, for example, the foundation species would be the corals, whose skeletons make up the reef. And we'll talk a lot about corals in an upcoming lecture. Not necessarily the same thing. Keystone species are species that cause major ecosystem changes when you remove them. The analogy is with the keystone of an arch, right? An arch is a bunch of wedge-shaped stones stacked in a semicircle, right? The keystone is the stone at the very top. And you can actually make an arch stand up without mortar. If you set it up right, you don't actually have to glue the stones together to get an arch to stand. But if you pull the keystone out, the entire thing comes tumbling down very rapidly. And so it is with keystone species. If you remove them, you cause major changes that ripple through all of the ecosystem. So an ecosystem engineer might be a keystone species, but not all keystone species are ecosystem engineers. They're not necessarily the same thing. So one cool example is oysters. Here's some oyster beds at low tide. The water has retreated, and all of this white, crunchy stuff that you're looking at is oysters and oyster shells, and oysters growing on oyster shells. Simply because they're there, they increase the available surface area for other critters to live by 50 times. I'm going to see if I can do this for us. You won't see this if you go to a seafood restaurant because they typically scrub the outside of their oysters. But if you get a bunch of oysters that have been pulled up just fresh off the ocean floor, they're absolutely covered with sponges and little shrimp and little polyps, little sea anemones and segmented worms and barnacles and snails that can drill holes in the shell and eat the oyster, called oyster drills. There is, the last time we did this and I ordered some live oysters, I think we collectively found a dozen species growing on top of the oyster shells without even trying very hard. So they create a huge amount of surface area, just more space for other living things to live in. They are filter feeders, so they filter water. They basically pump water in one tube, filter little food particles out to eat, and then pump the filtered water out the other tube, which means that they promote water transparency. Water is more clear around an oyster bed than away from one, which means that more sunlight filters down, which means you get more algae and seaweed growing in the vicinity. They can change the current flow. Specifically, they create a lot of little pockets of very slow current down in the cracks between their shells, where delicate organisms can survive. They basically determine the whole structure of the ecosystem. They're the foundation for the whole thing. So they create the habitat that all of those little oyster drills and worms and shrimp and things like that live in. Another big one that we'll talk about later, and one that is threatened on a global level now, are some specialized trees known as mangroves. Mangroves are tropical, they're very salt tolerant. Most plants are killed by salt water. Mangroves actually root themselves at the edge of the ocean. Their roots trap soft sediment, which means that mounds of sediment build up that critters can colonize. There are species that specialize in living on the roots and may not live anywhere else. There are species that feed on the species that live on the mangroves and so on. There's a whole community hanging around on mangrove roots. Globally, this is kind of an endangered ecosystem because the places where mangroves grow also tend to be the places where people like to build condos. A couple of years ago, I went to visit my wife's uncle, who is a real estate tycoon in Florida. And Sandpeak Beach is very nice, but pretty much almost all of the old mangrove habitat has been bulldozed a long time ago to build up places to put hotels and t-shirt shops and retirement communities. Not that those things aren't fun in their own way, but this is one of the reasons why we don't have nearly as much mangrove habitat as we used to. I'll talk about that later, but the mangroves themselves would be ecosystem engineers. The whole community that lives around those roots is there because of the mangroves. So there's a typical view of the UCA campus, and there's the keystone. That wedge-shaped stone at the top of a semicircular arch. If you pull the keystone out, the entire arch comes tumbling down. And a classic keystone species was the California sea otter that we began this with. They are marine mammals, of course. They spend almost all of their lives at sea. They dive to the bottom and feed on clams and snails and crabs and things like that. They'll pick up stones from the bottom and then bring up clams and bash them against the stone and eat the soft parts. They're tool-using mammals. And because they spend their entire lives in extremely cold water, they have very thick fur that is excellent insulation. They also feed on these critters. These are sea urchins, distant cousins of starfish. And the reason this matters is that sea urchins graze on giant seaweed that's attached to rocky ocean bottoms off the coast of northern and central California. Giant seaweeds known as kelp, which is so famous that the Beatles wrote a song about it. Kelp! The giant seaweed kelp, not just any seaweed kelp, big seaweed who kelp. Okay, please tell me you've all heard of the Beatles. Okay, I had a student once who had not. You know, at first I was ready to condemn her whole generation, but then she told me she grew up in Russellville, and I went, okay, that explains everything. Right. Sea urchins graze on kelp. Kelp is the foundation species here because kelps can reach 100 feet long because they've got gas bladders on their blades, on those leaf-like growths. In the ocean, they can stand straight up and create a forest under the surface of the ocean. And there's a great many species of fish and other critters that like living in and around kelp forests. If you get bored, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has been doing live streams of its tanks during the pandemic and the quarantine. So if you ever really need something to relax to, go on Facebook and tune in their live streams. You can just watch, a live kelp forest in real time with fish swimming around in it. It's quite soothing, and you'd be surprised if you've never seen this kind of ecosystem before, what kind of diversity there is. So kelp would be the ecosystem engineer. It creates this whole community of places to live. Sea otters were driven almost to extinction by the fur trade. Remember, I mentioned that their fur is very, very warm and snug. This made them very attractive targets for, in the 1700s and 1800s, it was mostly Russian fur traders. Coming from Alaska down the Pacific coast, there was actually a Russian fort in Northern California for a time, a place called Fort Ross. And with one thing and another, the sea urchin population by 1911 was down to 1,000 left, from as many as 300,000 before. They've been wiped out of Alaska, out of, I think the remnant population was in Central California, but they had lived up in Oregon, Washington, Alaska, all the way to the Aleutian Islands, and they had simply been wiped out of all of there. The result was, without sea otters, did I say the sea urchins had been wiped out? Okay, I clearly have too much blood in my caffeine stream. The sea otters had been wiped out, and these sea urchins exploded because they now no longer had their major predator, and the sea urchins rasped away at the, technically not the roots, they're called holdfasts, the structures that seaweeds like kelp use to attach to a rocky substrate. And so the kelp was destroyed, the urchin population exploded, and the ecosystem became much more barren, and many of those fish species also shrank in numbers as their kelp habitat was destroyed. Now that the sea otters have come back, now that they've recovered, the ecosystem is being restored. Now that there's no longer so many urchins, more kelp survives, and that means more of this kelp forest community survives. So it's making a comeback. But here we've got kelp that's the foundation species, but the sea otters are the keystone species, because if you remove them, the whole thing falls to bits. Okay, that would appear to be that. Do I have any questions? Okay, the people here in Live World seem to be pretty happy. Let's see, do I have any questions on the chat? Let me see. Okay, I do not seem to have any questions on the chat. Anybody got something? Okay, if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. And I will see you folks, or see your initials in a colored circle on Friday.